Why did Luke consider Force lightning to be an abomination of the Force? Greetings and welcome back to the archives. By the time of his journey into Jedi knighthood, Luke was becoming much more accustomed with the ways of the Force. He had begun to use telekinesis with ease and was able to use the mind trick with mastery, even learning how to calm the minds of friend and foe alike. Though he hadn't completed his training under a formal Jedi Master, Luke's own studies made him a formidable Force user by the time of Return of the Jedi, and the canon comics are currently exploring Luke's year-long journey into knighthood from the moment that he left Bespin. But of course, being one of the only Force wielders of the galaxy of the time, Luke wasn't running around a whole lot with other Darksiders. By now the Inquisitorius had faded into memory, and the only two Sith were his father and the Emperor, with this being where Luke's focus lay, having to fight them one more time, learning whatever he could about the ancient enemy. But with all of that said, Luke had very little exposure to archaic ways of using the Force, which left him completely unprepared to face the signature weapon of the Emperor, something that Palpatine was counting on, as the true power of Sith Force lightning as described is far more nefarious than many may think. It is a pure embodiment of rage and hatred, one of the most vile Force abilities. The Return of the Jedi novelization, thankfully, gives us insight into how Luke was feeling the moment that he saw Sidious's attack, and how he viewed this strange new sorcery, and he had considered it to be a straight-up affront on the Force itself the moment that he sensed it. So, come with us today as we open a holocron and discover why Luke thought that Force lightning was an absolute abomination on the Force, a true sin. But before we begin, we have had a terrible vision of our own. Many of the acolytes who use our archives have not yet subscribed yet, so if you've been enjoying the daily Star Wars uploads, reach out and crush that subscribe button. It is your destiny, we have foreseen it. The novel says this about Luke's encounter with Sith lightning. Palpatine raised his spidery arms towards Luke. Blinding white bolts of energy corsated from his fingers, shooting across the room like sorcerous lightning, instantly tearing through the insides of Luke, looking for ground. The young Jedi was at once confounded and in agony. He'd never heard of such an ability before, such a corruption of the Force, let alone have to experience it. In this moment, Luke was just as perplexed as he was in pain. Many have accused Yoda and Kenobi for not having taught Luke the ways of the Dark Lord's lightning, but Yoda indeed had told him not to underestimate the powers of the Emperor, and the two of them had had a lot to say to Luke in very little time. Unfortunately though, the Jedi's focus was on Luke's vulnerability of being corrupted by the Emperor, not the Emperor's direct power. The Jedi wanted to ensure that Luke's mental defenses were keener than his physical, and because of their lack of time, there was no preparation to be had of Luke actually facing down Sidious himself. In truth, Kenobi and Yoda both thought the boy to be wildly ill-prepared. It was more than likely that he was expecting Sidious to choke him, or begin hurling objects at him like Vader had. He threw away his lightsaber in that moment, with Luke not expecting the Emperor to have any weapons he could have dealt with through his own power. But of course, the boy was wrong, and Luke was ill-prepared by just how dangerous Force lightning was. I almost like to think of it as if Sidious senses Luke's ignorance, leading into the legendary line, "You fool. Only now, at the end, do you understand." What's fascinating about this moment is Luke's opinion on this ability. This is the first time that he's seen the Force used in such a way. Luke immediately views it as a corruption, as he can sense the intent behind it, a perversion of the Force. Luke had been taught by Kenobi and Yoda that the Force was an energy which gave shape to life. It was connected with every living being in the galaxy, and together, that is what gave the Jedi their power. Luke's entire opinion on the Force was one of purity and peace, of life. He could understand through Yoda's training on Dagobah how he connected with his sister in his time of need, that the Force was meant to bring everything together and to keep life in harmony. But this lightning was nothing but pain and destruction. It was hatred in the purest form, which desired only death. As the spiders of electricity crawled up and down through his body, ravaging his flesh and charring his very insides, this was the opposite of giving life. This was not the Force as Ben and Yoda had spoke of. looking at it from this perspective. Of course Luke believed that this was a corruption. In the Legends novels that follow Return of the Jedi, they inform us just how much Luke has suffered after receiving such a lethal dose of the ability. In fact, it tells us that he was wheelchair bound for several months, up to a year following being attacked. Not only this, but it goes on to explain that he would be thrown into fits of convulsions and even seizures. Sidious had truly decided to show him the extent of his power, and tried to kill him in the most painful way possible. If Luke hadn't been who he was, he should have died. Along with these seizures, he would have nightmares as well, as he actually had trouble using Force abilities. Needless to say, Luke's first encounter with Force lightning was extremely traumatizing to the Jedi, and from that point on, Luke would harbor a distinct venom for all darkside abilities. In the Book of the Sith, a now Grandmaster Luke is heavily critical of Sith sorcery and Sith lightning in particular. He criticizes them for being reckless or plain evil when talking about the power or effect on the mind. The Sith book instructs the reader to use these powers as a means for domination or instilling fear. Luke, though, speaks of using them to calm his mind and those in distress. Luke mentions that the Sith only ever see things in the negative. And in one of the greatest examples in the book, when Darth Bane speaks of several abilities including Sith lightning and convection, which was the ability to raise the temperature of one's fists to burn an opponent when striking them, or cryokinesis, which was the act of leeching vitality from someone to leave behind a frost-shrouded corpse. To all of these abilities and powers, Luke said this: Sith tactics do as much harm to the user as they do the victim. The dark side corrupts everything that it touches. It's hard to understand why people who know this choose this path nonetheless. It's important to note, though, that despite all of this, Luke would go on to study the Force, and he would undoubtedly find Plo Koon's entry in the Great Jedi Holocron. This recorded the findings of the ability known as Electric Judgment or Force Judgment. Prior to Master Plo Koon, the Jedi variant of Force Lightning was known to be forbidden, as the Council claimed that it harbored aggressive feelings, even if those feelings were a strong sense of desire to administer justice. Plo Koon, though, being a Kel Dor, came from a people who had a harsh, no-tolerance justice system. They were all lawful good by nature, but would punish to the extreme any criminal offense in order to maintain peace. Plo Koon would use this power in order to subdue an opponent on a mission by simply using it to knock them out. He then reported to the Jedi Council, who encouraged him to meditate on the ability, and whether he felt bad after using such a power, whether or not he had dipped into the darkness, even slightly. After doing this, though, Plo Koon again addressed the Jedi Council, and told them how after he had downed his opponent with the power, he felt absolutely no desire to continue hurting them or to kill them. He then requested to continue to study the ability, which he was ultimately granted. He would go on to document his experience in the Holocron, while giving it the name Electric Judgment. Grandmaster Luke would adopt this same ability. Despite his trauma experienced by Sith lightning, he was older and more powerful. He didn't let his bias blind him from other abilities. It would be Luke that would then perfect Electric Judgment, turning it into Emerald Lightning, allowing him to control the intensity at will. It would be this Emerald Lightning that Luke would use to great effect against the Yuzhong Vong. Luke considered this to still be a Jedi ability, since it was not wielded with malice or a desire to kill or inflict pain. But Grandmaster Luke never did seem to move on from his opinion on Sith lightning and abilities similar to it, and he was truly traumatized by this event, absolutely hating it, calling it an abomination of the Force. One of the worst Force abilities anyone could ever learn and use. So my friends, what are your thoughts on this? Do you believe Luke was correct in his assessment of the signature darkside ability? But what are your thoughts on his perfection of Electric Judgment? As always, my friends, thank you so much for visiting the archives and the channel today, and may the Force be with you always.